So today's March 9th. We're just about 2 weeks into this war. And the question I keep on getting from people more and more is, where's this headed? And of course, a lot of people are speculating about where it's headed. And I don't have a crystal ball. The thing I say over and over again, and I'll say it again, is trying to predict how a war will go is a fool's game. War is one of the least predictable human enterprises we can imagine, and this war already is a great example of it. Hasn't gone the way that the Russian army has predicted, hasn't gone the way most Western analysts predicted, right? Most analysts predicted that the Ukrainian army wouldn't hold out for more than a couple of days, and we're now 2 weeks in. So rather than trying to predict what's going to happen, I've got my ideas, but they're just ideas. And I think you can get a lot of this from the media anyhow. The standard predictions are, well, the Ukrainian army is still probably not going to last too much longer, and then we'll see. What I really want to focus on is kind of what the questions are that we should be focused on. What should we be thinking about? So rather than predicting what's going to happen, giving you some notion of what to watch for that will begin to give us a better idea of how this is going to go. So really four big questions that I think about. One is, how long is the Ukrainian army going to hold out? It's exceeded all expectations so far, but at the same time, we have people predicting that, well as it's done, it can't hold out forever. And that seems to be a pretty reasonable thing to say. And from the Ukrainian perspective, that's a pretty daunting idea, which is that as valiant as the Ukrainians have been, they may still be doomed. That's not a very happy thing to think. A big factor in how long the Ukrainian army is able to hold out, I think, will have to do with the speed with which the West can get really valuable arms to Ukraine, and the duration of time that those supply lines can be kept ongoing. Related to that is how long the Russian army can hold out. Not in the sense of actually having the capabilities. They've got a lot of weaponry. They've got a lot of soldiers. But the strategic center of this fight, in my opinion now, is not so much the Ukrainian army, which has shown how valiant it's going to be, but the Russian army. We're hearing today that contrary to what Putin apparently had been told, there are Russian conscripts in Ukraine. And that is important for two reasons. One is the conscripts don't want to be there. And already there are some reports that their mothers or their families back home are complaining about the fact that they were sent. Related to that is the fact that conscripts tend to be very poorly trained and poorly disciplined, and that might explain why things aren't going so well. But the other thing that's really interesting about that is that in the Russian army system, the conscripts, their term of service ends in April. And so what's going to happen come April? Are the conscripts going to be told, well, we told you you could go back home in April, but that's no longer the case? Or is a bunch of brand new conscripts going to be told, not only are you going into the Russian army, but you're going to Ukraine? So it's a bit of a tricky situation. More broadly speaking, do the Russian soldiers fight valiantly? Do they fight somewhat ardently, or do they begin to lay down their arms? We don't know. But I think that actually helps explain why some of the tactics are changing. It's a lot easier to get soldiers to lob in artillery shells and to drop bombs from 20,000 feet than it is to go into the kind of urban combat where people really get killed. So that's the first big question is how do the different armies relate to each other? Where's the morale the highest? The second big question, it has to do with Russia's strategy, which is still fairly opaque. How much territory is Russia going to try to conquer and to hold? Does it really focus on cities such as Kharkiv and Lviv and maybe Kharkiv and Kiev and maybe eventually Odessa, or does it focus on some of these big cities like Kharkiv and Kiev, but also the Black Sea coast where it's actually had the most success so far? Or does it go for most of the country or even the whole thing? A related question about Russia's territorial goals is the extent to which is the goal to seize and hold territory, or is the idea to put enough territory in play that you can then sit down to the bargaining table and get the bargain that you want? All of the indications we have so far is that the strategy is actually about conquering Ukraine, not simply about putting yourself in a position to bargain. But we'll have to see. To the extent this thing drags on, to the extent that the Ukrainian army does not hold out and that Kiev falls, Kharkiv falls, and so on, then the big question is how long does an insurgency last, and to what extent is it able to keep the cost for the Russians high? And when I say cost, I mean not only in lives, but in the cost it takes to run a war. Running a war of any kind is fabulously expensive, and especially given the sanctions that Russia is experiencing, the cost of war is going to become a factor sooner or later. Moreover, this question of the scale and scope of an insurgency is directly related to the previous question. The more territory Russia tries to hold, right, the thinner its troops will be spread, and the more susceptible it will be to insurgent activities. And so there are some, I think, difficult decisions for the Russian general staff and for Putin to make in that respect. And then the last big question, I think, and I think this is fairly hypothetical, but is can a peace deal be struck? And as I've already mentioned, one of the big questions is whether Russia even wants a peace deal to be struck. Is this a war that is being prosecuted with an aim to negotiating a favored settlement? Or, and I have to say this is my perception, is that at this point the goal of the war is not to negotiate a peace, but to dictate one, to essentially wipe out the Ukrainian army, to take Ukrainian territory, to install a Russian puppet government in Kiev, and then if you're going to negotiate with anybody, it's going to be with this puppet government. And in this respect, it's worth pointing out, it seems like Russia has said we want to get rid of Zelensky, and apparently there have been some attacks on Volodymyr Zelensky's life. To the extent that the goal is to actually take out the Ukrainian government, it's a sign that the goal is not to negotiate a peace. Because the only person who could negotiate a peace on behalf of Ukraine that the Ukrainian insurgents and other fighters would pay any attention to would be Zelensky himself. And so when you get rid of Zelensky, it's a sign that you're really planning on fighting the war and taking over the country, not on negotiating some kind of peace. So to get back to the idea of prediction, I would say that this conflict, from what I can tell, is still very much up in the air. A reasonable prediction is that Russia is going to get the upper hand based on the size of its military and its overall power, but it has not done that yet. And until it does, these questions, right? The morale of the Ukrainian army and the supply lines of the Ukrainian army versus the morale and the supply lines of the Russian army. The question of Russia's strategy, how much territory does it try to conquer and hold? The question of Ukrainian insurgents to the extent that the Ukrainian army can't fight anymore, and these goals of a peace deal. These are the things that are actually going to determine how this thing goes. And I would say all of them are still up in the air at this time, which, we'll just have to see. I mean, it's. I'm talking about all these strategic questions, and it's important to remember that innocent people are being bombed into smithereens while this is happening. But that is exactly what the two sides are doing to each other. Russia bombing Ukrainian civilians into smithereens, and the Ukrainians trying to kill Russian soldiers to really affect, in particularly that first factor, which is to try to get the other side to not want to fight anymore. That is the ugliness of warfare, and that's what's going to determine the outcome of this.